This is the biggest, most expensive slab that I've ever bought. And I'm using it to build the most expensive table that I've ever sold to a client who kind of scares me. Let's back up. This slab is absolutely massive. 215 inches, which is 1 inch short of 18 feet. But I guess none of that really matters because I'm actually going to cut it in half. Now I'm sure that's going to make some of you mad, but before I explain why, as you could probably guess, with this being the biggest slab I've ever bought, it's also the most expensive. A very specific $10,710. And I'm sure you're thinking, why spend all that money on a huge slab if you're just going to cut it in half? Great question. And I promise there's a very good reason and a very bad reason too, both of which I'm going to be very honest and transparent about. Like I said, this is going to be a dining table for a client. His name is Oleg, and I'm going to give him a fake last name, so let's say Oleg Valenikov. And Oleg kind of scares me. Now I should say, he hasn't done anything wrong. In all of our interactions, he's been great to deal with. Honestly, an ideal client, which is why I don't totally understand why he kind of scares me. I mean, here's literally everything that I know about him. His name is Oleg Valenikov. He owns a yacht. He lives in a high-rise on a beach in Miami, and his emails are short, like really short. For example, I'll send him a long breakdown of design options and budgets, and he'll reply, yes, that's it. And when I told him the price of this table, $27,500, he wrote back almost immediately with, okay, send me your bank details. Bone chilling, right? Now I know what you're thinking, scammer. I would probably think the same thing, but I'm 99% sure he's legit, and I'd better hope I'm right because in the meantime, I just cut a $10,000 slab in half, and I don't know what kind of return policy the lumberyard has, but I'm pretty sure I just violated it. Okay, so why am I cutting the slab in half? The whole reason I got this slab in the first place was to build Oleg's dining table, which needs to be 108 inches long and 46 inches wide. Now, buying a slab is kind of like the exact opposite of buying a 2x4. When you need a 2x4, you roll into Home Depot, and you know the exact size that every 2x4 is going to be. You could bet your life on it. Pick out 100 2x4s, and each and every single one is going to be 3.5 by 1.5, obviously. But with a live edge slab, there's no such thing as a 108 by 46. You just hunt around until you find the one that works best, but it's never going to be exactly perfect. So generally, the way to do it is you find something that's slightly bigger than what you need. For example, on GL Veneer's website, I might filter for slabs that are between 49 and 60 inches wide, and then let's say 121 and 144 inches long. And a couple of these look promising. At first glance, I'd say maybe this one. And I'm about 75% certain that I could get a table this size from this slab, but it's definitely going to be cutting it close. Now, back when I was first quoting a price to Oleg, we hadn't picked out a slab or even landed on a design. But I gave him an estimate in the range of $25,000 to $30,000. And since Oleg is a hands-off kind of dude, he was leaving the picking out of the slab to me, which means the price of the slab is kind of my problem. If I go with this slab and make it work, there's plenty of profit margin. But if for whatever crazy reason I decided to go with this slab, well, then it better be a passion project because I just blew my entire budget. So after a lot of searching, I found this guy, which is quite a bit bigger than something like 11571, but not that much more expensive. And in my mind, there's way more upside than downside. Really, the only downside is that I'll make about $3,000 less in profit on this table, but the upsides are, 1, I'll be 100% certain that I'm gonna have all the materials I need for Oleg's table and then some. 2, I can be picky about what wood I choose to use. And 3, I'm gonna be left with a massive chunk of wood that I can use to make a whole extra project. And actually on that note, I've already got some good ideas, and I might just build something on speculation. But if anybody watching this wants me to use this chunk to build a custom piece for them, reach out soon and we'll see if we can put something together. Also, even if you're not in the market for buying a slab, go poke around and do some window shopping on GL Veneer's website. It's fun. And if you ever do want to buy a slab from them, tell them that you saw them in a Foureyes video, and Dan said that he'll give you a 15% discount, which on this guy would be, what, like over $4,000. So that was the upside. Now, one of the downsides is slabs like this are just rare. Even at GL Veneer, one of the biggest suppliers in the country, there's only about 20 Claro walnut slabs this long. So I know some people, when they saw this shot, will say, "No, how could you cut such a big, beautiful slab in half?" And I suppose I could reply, track saw, circular saw, heck, even a jigsaw if you're patient. But for real, I get it. And I did feel a little bad. Maybe 10% of me felt bad. And then the other 90% of me was thinking, holy shit, this is a lot of money. What the hell am I doing? But you know what? We're all still alive, so let's proceed. One of the weird things about this slab is that it was actually way too thick, which I know sounds like a blessing, but it can be a curse. Right, fellas? Dan, the guy at the lumberyard, told me that there must have been some bandsaw drift when they were resawing it, but thankfully they have this giant Pac-Man machine that can make pretty short work of thinning the slab, but it won't flatten it, and there is a difference. Now this is always really hard to show on camera, so you can let me know if it worked, but my slab currently has a twist in it. So I put it on my CNC and shim it so that the high points are equal, and then I can run a flattening pass, and after I've worked my way down about 1/2 inch, it should have hit material on the entire surface, which means now this face is flat. Then at that point, I can flip the whole slab over and run a few more passes, and once I'm hitting material everywhere, I'll know that it's flat and consistently thick. And here's a quick animation that probably shows it better. Bowed slab, CNC removes the high spots until one face is flat, flip it over, CNC removes the high spots until the other face is flat and consistently thick. Which one made it more clear?
The animation. And it was cute.
A couple minutes back, I mentioned how I'm 99% certain that Oleg is not a scammer. And here's why. Only a handful of you will probably remember this, but about 1.5 years ago, I put out a video where I was building this table for a customer, and right at the end, I accidentally cut a giant slot straight through the top. Yeah, that was a fun day. Now I don't want to relive it here, but if you want to see that carnage unfold, I'll put a link in the description. And anyway, as you might have guessed, that mistake killed the sale. Thankfully, I was able to fix it with a series of inlays, and then I was able to list it for sale on my website, and a few weeks later, I got an email from, you guessed it, Oleg, who bought the table. So, if this were some kind of trick, I guess kudos to Oleg on the long con. But I'm pretty sure since there was no funny business that time around, we should be in the clear. Right? I think. Because here's where things get interesting. Oleg has had that dining table for a little over a year, but now here we are again with him buying another dining table because that old one is too small for his new place. So part of the deal with this one is he's shipping back the old top. That way I can build a new base for it so that he can use it as a coffee table moving forward. Long con? Again, I don't think so. I mean, honestly, I can't even imagine how the logistics of all of that would work. So if he is tricking me, then I don't know, I guess I deserve to be tricked. But bottom line, I'm putting my faith in Oleg. Yeah, his short emails scare me a little, but I don't think he's malicious. I think he's just efficient. Exactly 1 year ago, I started using this new technique to build forms, and so far, it's been working out gangbusters. Basically what I do is I lay out a sheet of the most heavy-duty plastic drop cloth that I can find, which is 6/1000 of an inch thick, but don't worry, I fold it so it's doubled over. Then I build up my form around it. Now I like to give credit where credit is due, so I did not come up with this idea on my own. I actually got the idea from a commenter who saw me struggling to remove my slab from a form and suggested lining it with a plastic sheet so that it wouldn't stick. He even mentioned that they use a similar technique on carbon racing kayaks. So I decided to take it a step further. I figured the plastic sheets must be leak-proof, right? So why build a traditional form at all? And since I tried it, I haven't looked back. Really, there's only one downside, which I'll show in a minute, and I can't tell you how much money I've saved in caulking over the last 12 months. Plus, we have a saying around here. If it's good enough for carbon racing kayaks, it's good enough for tables. Okay, that was a callback to a joke that I made the first time that I tried this technique. And a bunch of you said that I should make t-shirts, which honestly I wouldn't be opposed to, but let's be real, I'd probably sell like 8. Okay, speaking of scammers, I got an email last week that kind of broke my brain. I honestly can't tell if it's a scam or something much more stupid. I'll throw it on screen so you can pause and read it if you want. But regardless of what it is, it's definitely written by AI. There's a few dead giveaways. First, the general tone is just kind of politely bland. Second, the punctuation, specifically this, the M dash. Humans don't really use these, but AI loves them. And third, maybe the biggest giveaway of all, this. So again, I'm not sure if it's a scam. I feel like it's too detailed and lacks any sense of urgency like you usually find. I think it might just be somebody casting a wide net to try to find the cheapest price. And look, I respect saving money, but you gotta know when it makes sense to do it. Like paper plates for Friday's office potluck? Yeah, go cheap. But elective cosmetic surgery on your face? Yeah, maybe go ahead and spend a little. And I would slot custom built-in furniture right around here. Also, if you're gonna save money here, maybe spend a little more here. All right, I wanted to get some good shots to show how easily the plastic comes off of the slab, but in true irony, it came off so easily that I never got the chance. So I guess you'll just have to settle for this one. Now, I had mentioned that there is one downside to this plastic sheet technique, and it's this right here. It never lays perfectly flat, so there's always a few spots where it kind of sucks up and creates a little valley. Not a big deal though, because there's always going to be other spots on the underside that need to get filled, so it's not really creating any extra steps, but it does create a little extra downtime because I prefer to fill this with more of that deep pour epoxy, which takes about a week to fully cure. But here I'm fine with that because during that week I've got plenty of other things I can be doing, like designing and building an entire base. So as usual, my emails with Oleg were brief. I sent him a few ideas, he very quickly picked one, and at least from what I can tell, it seems like he's confident leaving the details to me, and that's kind of the good and the bad of it. Not a lot of time spent going back and forth, not a ton of pre-planning, he's just trusting me to make the best decisions. So I've got a lot of big chunky pieces of wood here, and to help keep things simple, rather than showing you the finished design right now, I'm going to make my 3D models so that it reflects what I'm currently working on, with the pieces closer to how they look in that moment. I hope that makes sense. So here's a very blocky, color-coded version of the pieces that I need to rough out. And don't worry, they're not going to be this color scheme. Though it does kind of have a Miami vibe, so who knows, maybe Oleg would like that. Let's not find out. So I told you that I gave the client a fake name, Oleg Valenikov. Well, to me, and maybe some of you, that sounds like a totally believable fake name. But I bet if you're from that part of the world,
USSR,
it probably sounds like a pretty goofy fake name. Some of you might remember this, but there was a meme about a 90s baseball game called Fighting Baseball, which was developed in this part of the world,
Japan,
where they didn't have access to the real MLB roster, so they just faked it and came up with a bunch of names like Sleeve McDykel, Bobson Dugnut, and Todd Gonzalez. Well, to people from Russia, or one of the former Soviet countries, Oleg Valenikov probably sounds kind of like Glenn Allen Mixon does to an American. Close, but just not quite right. Like that time that your grandma bought you a new pair of Sormy headphones. She meant well, and she did a great job actually. Yeah, they sound great. Thanks, Grandma. Okay, so all of the wood you see me cutting here, I ordered from a place called Woodworker Source, and I messed up ever so slightly. So when you go to a lumberyard, they sell wood in something called the quarter system, and it's kind of goofy, but 4 quarters means 1 inch thick, 6 quarters means 1.5 inch thick, and so on. And I'm not going to sit here and defend their decision. I'm just telling you that's how they do it. Now, a lot of places don't even stock it, but for this project, I needed 12 quarter wood, which would be, yeah, 3 inches thick. Good job. Anyway, when I ordered it, I specified that I wanted boards wider than 8 inches and longer than 84 inches. So the pieces usually end up, say, around 87 inches long. Well, in the time between ordering the wood and it showing up, I realized that I needed pieces that were longer than 87 inches. And there's no good way to elongate your wood. Trust me, I've tried all the techniques. Thankfully though, you can make it thicker. And as luck would have it, I had some big wide boards of 6/4 laying around. So I could rip a thin strip off a couple of those boards and then laminate them together to make the piece that I needed. Now here's the best part. After doing all that, I realized that building it this way was actually a bad choice, and I should really build it this way, where all of the end grain, which is represented by the red pieces you can see in this image, will be hidden. Which meant that instead of this piece being longer than 87 inches, it could be shorter than 87 inches. So basically a bunch of extra work for nothing. Now the good news is I can still use this piece. The seam came out pretty much invisible on one side, and the only way you could even see that piece is if you were laying under the table. Plus the face grain is actually prettier than the other wood. And as for the other seam, well, that'll be under the tabletop, so all good there too. I got a really great question the other day, and it's a little long, so feel free to pause and read. But the gist was, how much does your YouTube popularity affect the price of your work? In other words, if you didn't have a following, could you charge as much? And I want to give the most truthful answer that I can. So in short, I think it does affect the price of my work. And I don't think I'd be able to charge as much without it. Now, obviously, I have no way of actually knowing, but here are what I think are a few of the factors. First, the most obvious things, like demand and matchmaking. More views equals more people who might want me to build them a piece. But more importantly, better matchmaking, which means the right clients who already value what I do are more likely to find me, and I think that alone moves up price. Next, when somebody reaches out to me because they've seen a video, it's like having the ultimate version of a referral. Think of how much you value a trusted friend's recommendation on like a restaurant or a plumber or whatever. I think it's kind of like that, but amplified. So more trust equals less risk, which again equals more value. Now this next one certainly isn't true for everybody, but I would guess that some of my clients like the fact that there's an entire video that documents the designing and building of their piece. I'm sure some clients couldn't care less about that. For example, Oleg probably doesn't care, but again, I think it factors in. Then there's the less obvious things. And these all kind of blend together, but if I had to boil it down to one idea, it would be opportunity cost. And here's a really stupid example. Imagine you needed your tire changed, but for whatever reason you insisted on having Brad Pitt do it. Well, when he gives you an estimate, the way he would determine his fee would be the cost to change a tire, plus the opportunity cost of his next best alternative, let's say maybe an appearance fee. Then he might tack on an additional fee for a grand total of $1,500,040, which is very different from Tony, who normally changes your tire, because Tony's next best alternative is not changing a tire. Well, my reality is somewhere between Brad and Tony's. Honestly, when I'm picking which projects to build, I'm mostly asking myself, will this make for a good, interesting video? And because I only make about 10 videos per year, and maybe 3 of them are client projects, that leaves a very small pool of what I can actually say yes to. And on top of that, I still have to be selective to pick the ones that I think, and hopefully you'll think, are most interesting. So to get back to JC's original question, I guess it's a combination of all those things. And I'm sure if you asked anybody running a traditional furniture business who builds, say, 50 pieces a year, they could probably group them into buckets like should have said no, average, good, and great. Well, it's almost like I'm only saying yes to these and ignoring the rest. And I think that makes things look disproportionately good. Now, for the record, I'm not saying that my path is the better, smarter path. I can guarantee you there's a lot of people running traditional furniture businesses that make a whole lot more money than I do. But I picked this path because, honestly, it's what I love. Designing original pieces, getting to say no to a commission so that I can build a keyboard stand for my kids instead. Editing together videos where Brad Pitt runs a fictitious tire store. I love that stuff. And I try to remind myself a lot that none of this would even be possible without people like you watching it. So thank you, sincerely. And if you'd consider subscribing, I would really appreciate it. All right, I'm going to put a pin in it there, but JC, if you could do me a favor and get into contact with AJ, I'd appreciate if you could pass this info along to him as well. Right now, all of my pieces are milled to their final thickness, about 2 3/4 of an inch, and I'm cutting miters on everything. So we're still in oversized, chunky territory here, but every piece is getting a 15-degree angle. You get one, everybody gets one. So the question I always get whenever I build these trapezoidal shapes is, how do you know how long this piece needs to be? And the secret is, I really don't. I already cut both angles on the lower piece, and I know that I want the finished height of the base to be 28 inches. So I can just set my top piece on the assembly at 28 inches up from the bottom, mark my cut lines, and that's the length. Now in theory I could use geometry or trigonometry or whateverometry to figure out how long this piece should be, but I guess given the fact that I don't even know if it's trigon or G that I should use, I think the practical way is safer. Plus, doing it the math way is actually worse because it doesn't account for little mistakes that might have happened on the way here. Like, what if those 15-degree angles are actually 14.9 degrees? But doing it the practical way bakes the real world into the measurement and tells you exactly where to cut for a perfect fit. By the way, I'm being modest. It's 83 9/16 of an inch. But still, the practical way is better. Okay, before we assemble, it's time to get out of this blocky, chunky zone. So I'm gonna make myself a template. Now I've shown myself doing this dozens of times at this point in different videos, and I always flip-flop back and forth between doing it like this or on my CNC. I guess it just kind of depends on my mood for that day. Does it feel like a sit down at the computer day or a cut stuff in the shop day? And here I went with the manual way. All that said, here's the finished shape, which is gonna transform our table from this to this.
Yeah, this looks more defined and elevated, whereas the other one looked very basic. But I mean, if someone likes that style, but I'm used to the more elevated. I don't know what I'm talking about.
So assembling is going to happen in two phases. The first one's the sub-assembly phase, where I'm going to take these 16 pieces and turn them into 5 sub-assemblies. And the reason that I made the template before doing this is because I'm going to use dominoes, and I want to make sure that I cut them in the right place. Now, to be honest, I'm not really worried about how much weight this table is going to be able to handle. Like, I think you could park a car on it, as long as it was something small, like this. But I'm still going to load each joint up with 4 of the largest dominoes. Actually, on the last table that I made that Oleg bought, I made my own super-sized dominoes. And it was a fun little experiment, but I don't think it was actually necessary, so these will be fine. That said, what I am slightly worried about are rotational forces. But whether that happens or not is really going to come down to the thickness of the actual parts, and then how the sub-assemblies tie into the long centerpiece. And I got a couple ideas there. Now, the only tricky part about this stage of the assembly is that long centerpiece. After the glue dries, there's still going to be a lot of material to remove to create the final shape. And to remove the bulk of the material, I mark out the whole shape in chalk and then use the bandsaw to cut just outside of the lines. But on the big piece, it's a lot easier if I flip the order. Mark the lines in chalk, cut them on the bandsaw, and then assemble. Question: why is woodworking considered a manly hobby? Now, I'm not saying that it is a manly hobby, but why is it thought of as one? You know, like wrenching on your car, Krav Maga, or playing Magic the Gathering. Now, you can't deny it definitely does skew dude. Just look at my channel demographics. 90% male. And I doubt that this is a perfect microcosm for the rest of society, but I'll bet it's more accurate than not. So let's assume there's maybe a 15% margin of error, and agree the real statistic is that somewhere between 75 and 105% of woodworkers are guys. Now, for the record, I don't think there's any advantage that you get as a woodworker by being a guy. In fact, I think the idea that woodworking is a masculine hobby actually creates a disadvantage if you bring that energy into the shop. Like one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make is being over aggressive or kind of trying to muscle your way through things. Perfect example is what you see me doing here. I didn't keep count, but to work my way through these pieces, which are 2 3/4 of an inch thick, I probably nibbled down over the course of like 10 easy passes. And if you think that makes me soft, then fine, I'm soft. But what can I say? I like my projects to come out nice, and I prefer it when they don't explode. And honestly, all doing it in 3 hero passes does is raise the chances of something catching and going wrong, having bad tear out, and a higher chance of injury, all for the benefit of saving almost no time. And arguably even losing time fixing a mistake or trying to sand through burn marks later on. Now, in fairness, I think only 50% of the problem is that kind of misplaced tough guy mindset. And the other half is just natural instinct. When you're using pretty much any power tool and you feel a little resistance, your lizard brain tells you to push harder. But 9 times out of 10, you're actually better off slowing down a little. Let the blade do its job and just feed it material at a rate that it can handle. Think of operating a power tool kind of like operating an elevator. A light touch on floor 7 is going to be the fastest path. But if you walk in and mash the entire panel with your open palm, it's going to take longer. And worse, you might end up somewhere you don't want to be. Last time we saw the slab, I was doing all the touch-up work on the underside, and now we can start getting things cleaned up. So the first order of business is I'm going to put it back on my CNC and try to do a really light pass on each side. Really, I just want to get below any epoxy that's still sitting on top of the wood. So I'm probably only removing maybe like a 32nd of an inch from each face. Then I'm going to do what should be my final touch-up work on the underside, using some 24-hour epoxy. And then, hang on. Then, the next day, I can sand that off, which I wish went like this. But that was an editing trick, and actually it goes more like this. Then I can flip it over, and now I'm getting my first look at what's going to be the top. Now, as expected, there's going to be some bigger areas to fill here. So I like to create these little dams using some hot glue, and then I'm going to use more of that deep pour epoxy that takes a few days to cure. And the reason for that is the deep pour is a lot, less viscous. Whichever one's more like water and less like honey, deep pour is like that. So because it's thinner, it gets into all the little nooks and crannies a lot better. Then, a few days later, I can clean that up, and then I'm going to take it off to a place called Street True Revival to use their drum sander. So, I think I might have lost some of the footage from this part. I swear I took more than what I have, but it's not really the most compelling footage anyway. I mean, it's mostly just dudes in overalls carrying wood. So, we're going to fly right past this part, but if you do want to see more content like this, go get subscribed to my new channel, Dudes in Overalls Carrying Wood. Moving on. Before we put the base together, I need to trim all of this extra stuff off of the subassemblies, which is pretty much right at the limit of what my table saw can handle. These pieces are 2 3/4 of an inch thick, and I think the maximum reach on my blade's 3 inches. But then after that, I need to trim the pieces to length here, which I would normally do on my table saw with a sled set up like this, but by the time I do that, the blade definitely won't reach. Now, I could make this cut on a miter saw, but I really want to make it in one pass so that the tips are perfectly aligned. Because if it's slightly off, rather than attaching to the centerpiece like this, it could end up like this. So the solution I came up with is this setup on the Craig ACS. Now, actually, the ACS couldn't reach all the way through the thickness in one pass either, so I had to cut from one side, flip it, and then cut from the other. But it works here because I could use these registration holes to make sure that I'm cutting a perfect 90, and then by setting up a stop block over here, I can make sure that I'm consistently cutting the same length. And once I set it up the first time, I can knock out all 4 really quick. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you've seen me use the ACS a bunch of times, but earlier in the video, you might have noticed me unboxing a new one. And that's because Craig just launched a new 20-volt cordless tool line, and they sent me a few of the tools to try out. Now this isn't an ad read. They sent me the tools. I'll use them, form an opinion, and then tell you what I actually think, good or bad. And that'll probably take me a few weeks before I know what I think. But I am genuinely curious to see how they hold up and perform, especially since Craig's always been a woodworking first company. And I know that they're going to be adding to this lineup in the coming months, so I'm excited to see what they come out with. I'll drop a link in the description if you want to check them out while I'm testing. But for now, I'll just say, so far so good. But I think I'll have more in-depth thoughts later. So far, we know a few things about Oleg. Short emails, yacht, high-rise in Miami, but what we don't know is how he likes his steak cooked. I'm gonna guess he's a medium rare man, but I wanna prepare for the worst and assume that at some point, Oleg's gonna have a dinner party and somebody's gonna eat a tough, well-done steak and they're gonna sit right here at the head of the table. And I wanna make sure that when that happens and they're trying to saw their way through their hockey puck fillet, this thing stays rock solid, no wobble. And step one is going to be making sure that we get a good connection here. So I'm going to cut a dado to the exact thickness of the leg assemblies. Now I thought about how to do this for a while. I thought about making some kind of jig at first, but while I was fiddling around, I realized that the distance between the edge of my router's base plate and the outside of the bit was exactly 1.5 inches. And if I take two of these little squares that I have, they're also exactly 1.5 inches. So that means I could butt those and a bigger square up to exactly where I wanted to cut, clamp the big square down, remove the little ones, and then I'll end up cutting right on my mark. Kismet. So that's what I did for the first 2 of the 8 dados that I needed to cut. And then I realized that there was a faster and even better way that I could do it. Because in addition to these dados perfectly matching the thickness of the piece that's going into them, I also need for the dado on the top and bottom to perfectly align with each other. And if I establish the outside edge first on my ACS, since I can make that in one cut, they will. Then I just need to make sure that I'm really careful when I'm clearing out the rest of the material between them, because there's not as much of a gap here. Now I did make a couple of mistakes. The first one was kinda dumb, and the second one was really dumb. But I'm a believer in always showing my mistakes because it's such an integral part of woodworking. And I figure by showing what I did wrong, hopefully it can help others avoid it altogether, or if they do find themselves in a similar situation, maybe it'll help them out of a bind. All right, mistake number 1. When I was cutting my very first dado, I didn't use a support block, and I got a nice little chunk of tear out right here in a pretty visible spot. Now, I couldn't help but to think about this comment that I got a few weeks ago, where a guy was talking about a mistake that I made, and he basically said that I half-assed the project, then he pivoted into this weird TED talk about like German engineering and mountaineers. But if you boil it all down, essentially what he's saying is, if you make a mistake, you should quit and start all over. Go ahead and let that sink in for a couple seconds. Now, the reason that I wanted to share this is because that's just such terrible advice. Perfect example, mistake number 2. When I was assembling the base, I got the first 2 legs installed and clamped up, and everything was looking good, but then I noticed that it wasn't perfectly square right here. Nothing you would ever visibly notice, but I figured, what the heck? I'll use a square and some clamps and pull it to 90. Well, turns out that was really dumb. Because while you would never notice this being 89 instead of 90 degrees, pulling it square caused a gap to open up on one side of the joint, and that you will notice. Now, while I wasn't happy about this, I think we can all agree that abandoning the entire table at this point and starting over would be pretty ridiculous. I mean, it would be insanely wasteful, but also, generally speaking, fixes like this are pretty easy. I always keep my offcuts laying around until after a project is over, so I'm confident that I can find a piece of wood that's going to match. Honestly, if I wasn't including this in the video, I would bet that Oleg would never even notice. Even in this shot, which is magnified to be larger than life, there's hardly even a sign of the fix other than this tiny little dot, which should go away by the time things are sanded and finished. So to that commenter, I disagree. It's not half-assing things. It's just being realistic. Just because something doesn't fit your definition of perfection doesn't mean you need to completely eradicate it from the face of the earth. I mean, what kind of person or society would do that? Anyway, that takes care of the aesthetic part of the fix, but now I want to make sure that the joints are really rock solid. Like I was saying before, remember? Because of Oleg's dinner party and the guy with the hockey puck steak. So I modeled this sort of bow tie shape and then cut out a few of them on my CNC, and I'm going to install one at each joint. And these are pretty good sized, about 6 inches long, 2 inches wide, and the two in the top are 1 inch thick, and the two in the bottom are 2 inches thick. And these should make the joint a lot stronger because first, it's increasing the amount of glue surface. Next, because now for this to flex, you'd have to also bend this piece, which would take a lot of pressure. And finally, because of the shape itself. Now it has a mechanical force that prevents the pieces from being able to pull apart. By the next morning, those were dry and I could trim and sand them flush. And I'll be the first to admit that these aren't the most beautiful part of the table, but they're purely for function, and once the top's on, you're never going to see them anyway. So it's kind of like finding out that the Mask era Cameron Diaz didn't have the most attractive pancreas. 7th grade me, still all in. Now, unlike this tabletop and base, unfortunately 7th grade me and Cameron never had a chance to connect, but now I'm going to drill a bunch of holes. First 9 of them that are going to go through the base and into the top. And all of these are going to be slightly oversized so that the bolt can wiggle a little, like you see here. That way nothing breaks apart when the top expands and contracts throughout the year. Then I'm going to install 7 leveling feet. And I don't know what my problem is, but like literally every time I use these, I think about the fact that they cost about $1.75 each. Yet they're carrying $27,500 worth of dining table. I don't know. It kind of feels like if you were going to hang the Mona Lisa and you went, yeah, those will do. That said, these things haven't failed me yet. And trust me, I would be happy to use something more expensive, but I've never been able to find anything at any price point that has as low of a profile. So I guess I'll stick with the cheap stuff. I know I said it would take me a few weeks to form my tool opinions, but I do have one early thought, and hopefully this doesn't make Craig regret their decision to give me tools. But hot take, I think some tools are just better corded. So first, this new track saw cuts like butter. Here I'm cutting through my tabletop in one pass, and it's making really easy work of it, and that's with a general purpose blade. It actually cuts better than the corded version that I'm used to, and I think that mostly has to do with the fact that it uses a thinner kerf blade. But you see how the dust collection here is really bad? Yeah, that's because despite the fact that I have everything hooked up, I forgot to actually turn my vacuum on. Because I'm used to the corded version, which I plug into my dust extractor's outlet, which causes the vacuum to kick on every time when the tool kicks on. So, not the tool's fault, definitely user error, but based on my track record so far, kind of feels like a mistake that I'm going to make a lot. Now, I'm not sure if their plan is to offer both the corded version and the battery version, but if so, I would petition for a thin kerf version of the corded saw. Or I guess I could just maybe put a post-it note on the handle that says dust or something that'll remind me. Now look, I totally get that if there could only be one, battery powered makes more sense because there's just times when a corded tool wouldn't work. But I guess if there's a takeaway, so far, the saw is fantastic, but the operator might need a firmware update. With the tabletop trimmed to its finished size, next I centered the base and marked through each hole so that I know where to install the threaded inserts. And I'm going to install 9 of them in these locations. And this will sound like a weird thing to say, but the one that's right here at the center of the table might be my favorite part of this entire project. Here's why. So after the threaded inserts, I'm installing some C-channel. And I'm always skeptical as to whether or not C-channel is actually necessary, but my rule of thumb is when I build a table like this, I think C-channel is redundant. But on a table like the one I'm building here, well, I still think it's probably not necessary, I don't mind it as an extra little insurance policy. So I'm doing 3 pieces. So for my favorite bolt, I'm going to try to get the center slot of the center C channel to perfectly align with the center of the table so that one bolt goes through the base, through the C channel, and into the top. Again, I know that's a very weird thing to have as a favorite part, but I think it's because installing C channel is a pretty mundane part of a project. So if you can find a way to spice things up by giving yourself a little challenge, you take it. It's like when they built the pyramids. That was already really impressive, but then they go above and beyond by making it point true north within like a hair of a degree or whatever. Well, this is basically the same thing. I mean, maybe slightly less impressive, but still pretty good. Back when we were working on the base, I put that detail on the legs where it's a big roundover with a crisp line. And now I want to give the top a similar but different treatment. So I'm starting with the biggest bit that'll fit in my router, a 1-inch roundover. And after getting that cut in and looking at it, it just felt a little small. So I borrowed Joel's bigger router and used a 1.5-inch bit, same one that I used on the legs. And I briefly considered trying to cut this on my router table, but I figured it would just be way too hard to try to maneuver. Plus, I've always wanted to try this one. By the way, in my last video, I had said that I was leaning towards getting a new router table. And a lot of you wrote in with suggestions, and long story short, that was still the one I want. But then I was talking to a friend who works for Rockler, who told me that a new version with a bunch of upgrades is coming. So I asked if I could mention this and got the okay. So here's a full list for anybody who wants to pause and read it. But the one that caught my attention first was the integrated lift, so that the table has a flat, solid surface instead of having an insert plate. That alone seems worth the wait for me.
Oh, man.
So, I don't know, I would say link in the description, but it doesn't come out until early 2026, so I don't even know what I'd be linking to. Alright, we're on the home stretch. So to start, I'm going to sand the entire top just up to 80 grit for now, just to see if there's any problem areas remaining. And of course, there are always problem areas remaining. Most of these showed up back when I was drum sanding with my dudes in overalls. So I'm going to do my last round of epoxy touch-up to get into all the little tiny holes and cracks that revealed themselves, and this should fix like 95% of these. Then I'm going to do a round of hot melt to get into the rest. And I used to use this stuff a lot more, but I've kind of backed off recently. I mean, it's good, but it has a more matte finish, so I try not to use it next to the epoxy. They're just slightly different. So I try to use it sparingly and only in isolation now. Next, I'm going to sand for real now, the entire top all the way up to 220 and the entire base up to 180. And after I get through all those grits, then it's time for finish. Now finish has this reputation for being every woodworker's favorite part of a build. They consider it sort of the climactic moment in a project, if you will. And I'll be honest, I've kind of grown to love it now too. So I'm using sample 73 here, and when it comes to ease of use and quality, I think this hits the perfect sweet spot. Shake the bottle for about 15 seconds to disperse the wax, mix it, wipe it on, wait about 20 minutes and wipe off whatever didn't absorb into the wood, and that's pretty much it. And as for the results, I think it's a perfect mix of enhancing the wood while keeping it natural looking. And sadly, at least for video, is that the best part is probably the feeling. I can't think of a good word to describe it, but it's just maybe inviting feeling, if that makes sense. And hopefully that'll translate to these beauty shots. So here she is, the most expensive table I've ever sold. And I know that most expensive doesn't necessarily mean best, but I really love how this table turned out. And as always, just like with every other project, I'd also love to hear what you think about the table in the comments. But more importantly, I really want to know what Oleg thinks. After all, he's the one paying for it and that's going to have to live with it. So I sent him a nice email and some pictures, and now I'm just waiting on his reply. And in typical Oleg fashion, the email was short. but that's nothing to be scared of. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.